I'm Sarah Wilson, and you're listening to the Roots and All Budcast. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Budcast. This is part 2 on this particular topic, so if you haven't already, I recommend that you go back and listen to part 1, which was released on the 5th of March, and it's titled Native versus Non-Native Plants. And I apologise now for my terrible, croaky, breathy voice in that episode, because I was just getting over a cold that lasted a month. And instead, for this episode, you'll have to put up with my terrible nasally voice, because as soon as I shifted the cough, then would you believe it, I came down with a cold. But that's enough moaning, so let's get on with it. So to recap part 1, I was talking about a wonderful but frankly terrifying book by Douglas W. Tallamy called Bringing Nature Home. If you haven't already discovered this book, you can buy a paper copy or the audiobook version, and I can't recommend it highly enough. It's essential reading if you're interested in wildlife gardening. And in that episode, I spoke about the rate at which we're destroying or disturbing the habitat around us, and that it's no longer enough to assume the wildlife that we shun from our gardens, development sites, and so on will move elsewhere, because there really is very little of this elsewhere left, certainly in countries such as the UK and the US. It's no longer good enough to think, oh, I'll just rip out those plants to put in a new driveway because the animals that were living in that lawn or those trees and shrubs I've just ripped out will move to the nearby waste ground or somebody else's garden, because we've squeezed our wildlife out of almost every last nook and cranny. And in that episode, I also spoke about declining insect numbers and the difference between insect generalists and specialists. And I also spoke about native versus non-native plants as sources of food, not only for pollinators, but also for the larvae of pollinators, plus a host of other insects. And it seems as if native plants are unequivocally best, and that this fact is quite likely being downplayed by those whose business it is to promote or to sell us non-native plants. And as an aside, no sooner did I mention the RHS's Plants for Pollinators range in part 1 than I got an email from a photographer who took some photos of a garden I designed a few years back. And it seems that this garden has been deemed to fulfill the criteria of perfect for pollinators on account of the number of RHS plants that are in it that I use in the planting scheme, and this means it will be marketed to publications and so on going forward as perfectly illustrating the idea of planting for pollinators. So I will also be making a concerted effort to include more of those plants to be shredded by caterpillars in my planting designs. So the feedback from part 1 was great. Everyone seemed to take all the doom and gloom very much on the chin, and a lovely friend of the podcast did comment that after listening to the episode, he wondered if we should even be gardening at all. And this is a thought that struck me too. Wouldn't we be better to just leave our natural surroundings to get on with it? Well, yes and no. We should certainly leave well alone if we don't need to interfere. The message needs to get through to everybody that it's okay to have natural areas, or wasteland as some might refer to it. It's okay to let trees grow up. We need to stop being scared of trees, particularly those in urban areas or near buildings. We don't have to mow or trim every last scrap of verge or communal ground, but we also don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And instead of feeling as if all is lost, we should work on ways to leave nature alone where we can and to incorporate it into our more cultivated ornamental areas when we want to, because we have to live our lives too. So how can we do this? Well, this is where I move on to the second book that I listened to, and it's the book I read looking for salvation after the harsh reality presented in Bringing Nature Home. And it's Darwin Comes to Town by Menno Schilthuizen. And he talks about a near future where 3/4 of the world's population lives in cities and the majority of our land mass is urbanised. And in direct contradiction to Tallamy, who says that species evolution is an incredibly slow process, Schilthuizen states the more pressure a species is under, the quicker it will evolve, and that certain species are actually using cityscapes to their advantage, which is true of wildlife such as pigeons. And he also mentions the mosquitoes that have made themselves quite at home in the caverns of the London Underground. And this harks back a little bit to what I spoke about in my last podcast. Are we happy to let many of the weaker species die out and be happy that those opportunist species that can flourish do so in their place? And if you did listen to the last episode, you'll know there are pretty good reasons why we shouldn't be favouring this approach and letting the generalists fill the niche left by the specialists. But where do we draw the line is a valid question. How much do we need to compromise, and how much do other species compromise? And it's a question that popped into my head when I was interviewing Hugh about hedgehogs in episode 17. And he mentioned that the heyday for hedgehogs was at the time of the enclosures, when land was parcelled up and hedgerows were becoming a more common feature of the landscape. And part of my contrarian nature wanted to ask, well, why should we aim to bring hedgehog numbers back up to what they were in their heyday? But of course I didn't, because it might sound churlish and I didn't want to upset lovely Hugh. But what is the correct population number for any one species, especially if the heyday of one species came at the expense of population numbers of other species? What date are we trying to reset the clock to? How can we work towards restoring nature if we have no idea what sort of picture we're working towards? And these are difficult questions for better brains than me to come up with the answers for, thankfully. But it is safe to say that nature should definitely not look like what it does now, let alone, I think, what it's predicted to look like in the future. So what can we do? How do we start to get better with being part of nature? Well, the first part is obvious. We need to get out in it. We need to put down our phones, open our windows, sit in the local park. If the ground's dry, don't sit on a bench, sit on the ground. Sit on the ground if it's wet too. It's not going to kill you. We should get our hands dirty. Research over the past couple of years has proven a direct link between mental health and immunity and the microbes found in soil. It's good to be in contact with good old-fashioned dirt. And most of us also know that time spent outdoors or even looking at green plants improves our mental health. This is an actual scientifically proven phenomena. And by the way, it's one that I will definitely be exploring in the future on the podcast. And what can we do in our gardens? Well, going back to Doug Tallamy, he believes there are 4 significant factors that contribute to the insect Armageddon I discussed in the last podcast. This decline in insect numbers has tremendous knock-on effects for whole ecosystems, and arguably 3 of these 4 factors, he cites, can be directly affected by gardeners in some form or another. And so firstly, habitat loss is one factor. And even if we're not directly contributing to this by tearing out sections of our gardens to replace them with paving, we may be buying products that contribute to habitat loss. Do you purchase peat-free compost every time? If not, then you're contributing to the loss of peat bogs habitat. And the second factor is the use of chemicals such as pesticides, fungicides and herbicides. And it's obvious what we can do straight away to help out on that front. But it also extends to the food we buy and the plants and seeds we buy. If we choose organic products as much as possible, we're helping to eliminate the products that cause harm beyond the confines of our own homes and gardens. And the third factor he cites is the importation of non-native plants. Now, I know this is a much more problematic issue, and I don't expect everyone to grow nothing but native plants. As I said, we have to find a balance that allows us to express our own individuality and creativity. And for many people who grow plants indoors and out, this involves a heavy reliance on non-native plants. However, we do need to look at the effects of importing non-native plants without any regard for their impact on our native habitats should they escape our gardens. And let's be honest, many of them do, and with disastrous effects. And this has happened not just in the UK, but globally. Non-native invasive species often gain a foothold where the landscape has been disturbed. Because they have no natural predators, they have a competitive edge over our native plants, and they can quickly take over. And of course, once they occupy the space the native plants used to, then they use the same amount of resources without providing any or providing very little benefit by way of food for invertebrates. And if you want an example of this, just think of Japanese knotweed. So in practical terms, what can we do in our gardens? Well, first of all, there are 1,407 native UK plant species, and we can get familiar with them. And you might be surprised to find how many you already have in your garden, or how many you already grow are already growing as ornamentals. For example, if you're shopping around for an attractive hedge and you want something that doesn't necessarily provide a thick evergreen block, you could plant for hornbeam, which is really versatile and it's an attractive plant. And of course, if you do want the thick green block, you could choose another of our native plants, the yew. Now, it's not always this simplistic, but I would urge you to take a look at the list of our natives. It's easy enough to find a list online of our native trees, but if you want an illustrated list of herbaceous plants, I recommend checking out britishflora.co.uk. And if anyone wants to share links to databases of native plants in their areas, please send them to me at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk or to one of my social media accounts, and I'll be really pleased to share them on social media and on my website. Plantlife.org.uk also has a list. If you go to Discover Wild Plants on their menu, then click on plant and fungi species. My only gripe with that list is that the plants are listed by their common names rather than their botanical Latin names, and these are useful to know. And as Talamy writes, nobody is suggesting that we rip out our existing plants and replace them immediately. It's more a case of natural attrition. When something dies off, perhaps consider replacing it with a native plant that has a similar form and function. And it's painful, but change is going to start at a small level this time. And it does start with us in our gardens and green spaces, however small they are. We'll have to start examining the implications of everything we do in our own gardens. Do we need to remove that oak tree that is blocking the sun to our lawn? Do we need to pull out that stray plant that seeded itself into a crack between the wall and the pavement? Do we need to keep every last square inch of our paths and paving weeded? Are we guilty of complaining to our council or homeowners association if the lawns and verges aren't kept neatly clipped? Do we need to talk to our friends and neighbours about why they need to be more tolerant of wildflowers and so-called messy green areas? In some areas, it's getting to the point where every dandelion left alone to grow freely will count. Our decisions have that much impact, so we do need to consider them really carefully. And non-native plants aren't going away anytime soon. And as I said, they probably never will. We will always want to garden using them. And the genie's really out of the bottle on this anyway. And according to some studies, non-native plants can extend the season and can feed pollinators at time when natives aren't flowering. But given the weird seasons we've experienced over the last few years, I'm not sure I'd hang my hat on that being a good enough reason to have a load of them, because I think they're probably filling in the gaps when there are no native early or late flowering plants available in the vicinity at the time the study was conducted. So speaking about my garden alone, I know there have been hellebores, ranunculus and ivy flowering since before I saw the first bees emerge. And do we still need to be worrying about pollinators too? Yes, we do. We need to be ensuring that the plants we choose offer at least something of use. So do things like swap out double flowers for singles as much as possible. And following on from the idea of being more tolerant of so-called weeds and messy areas, let's stop trying to cultivate and tidy every last square inch of our gardens. It's okay if you want to garden the area around your back door and nothing else beyond. If you've got a really long garden and you always struggle to keep on top of looking after the end of it, then don't bother. Stick a hedge halfway across your garden and forget the end bit. And this is fine. If you want to stop whatever grows in there from encroaching onto your cultivated section of the garden or into neighbours' gardens, leave a strip around the edge that you regularly mow. It acts like a no man's land for plants, so they can't escape their designated area by travelling. And if anyone tells you that you're encouraging rats, mice or other stupid things that people say, just smile and nod, because this is something that ignorant people say, and they're the sort of ignorant people who we're trying to pick up the pieces after. And thus concludes part 2 of my Scaring the Bejesus Out of You series. And thank you for listening. I hope I gave you food for thought, and I hope I also scared you a little bit, because I'm scared by what we've done and what many gardeners and those in the gardening industry and the gardening media would have us believe we should still be doing. I realise we're not going to change the way we or other people garden overnight, but at least let's be conscious of the consequences of each and every decision we make regarding the natural world. And I hope you'll join me for the podcast episode next Tuesday, because I am speaking about something altogether more lovely, and I'm speaking to Adrian of Scamp's Bulbs about daffodils. And I guarantee we have answers to every question you've ever had about daffodils, but been too afraid to ask. Plus, just to show you how unpredictable and contrary I can be, the Budcast that's out in a fortnight's time is an interview with Graham Blunt of Plant Based Nursery in Wadhurst, and Graham specialises in exotic plants. And we don't just discuss exotic plants though, we also talk about some legislation that's coming into effect at the end of the year that will have a massive impact on how plants are sold in the UK, which makes a no-deal Brexit look like, in Graham's words, a small gust of wind. So I hope you can join me for that. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next Tuesday.